Welcome, everyone. You passed the first test. You got here. Not always easy. A little labyrinth here at MIT. So welcome. You're at session 9.5, Data-Driven Digital Innovation. Wow, we are running out of seats, aren't we? You can sit up here with me if you want. There's one seat right here. My name is Wayne Eckerson. I'm the track producer. I run a research and consulting company specializing in data analytics here in Boston. But I'm much happier today to announce who this session is and who our moderator is, Effie Kilmer from Microsoft. And she's going to introduce our panel. But first, if you have questions, please raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you because this is all being recorded. And we have a virtual audience as well, so we want you on mic. And I'll also be taking questions as they come in via the Whova platform. So with that, welcome, and over to you, Effie.
Thanks so much, and thank you everyone for joining today's session. My name is Effie Kilmer. I'm the Chief Data Officer Engagement Lead at Microsoft, and I have the privilege to moderate today's panel. Joined with us, we have two speakers. One, Karthik Ravindran, who is the General Manager of Enterprise Data at Microsoft. He's been with Microsoft for over 20 years. In the past 10 years, he's been leading our data domain practice and has been taking Microsoft on our own digital transformation journey. Next speaker we have here is Marco Vernocchi. Marco is with EY. He's the Global Chief Data Officer, has been in the industry for about 30 years now and been with EY for 3, leading multiple transformations inside of EY. So I'm pleased to say we aren't going to have a PowerPoint. This is going to be a discussion-based session for the next hour. It might be a surprise to you, given we're from Microsoft and EY. But we have a few questions, and we'd like to open it up for questions at the end, too. So we want to keep this a collaborative, open discussion with the theme of how do you keep pace with innovation in today's world? So with that, I'll ask the first question over to Karthik. Karthik, again, you've led Microsoft's digital transformation. Very curious to hear about the journey that you've embarked with the team and how you've created the culture inside of Microsoft and some of the best practices to share with the group here.
Yeah, thank you, Effie. Hey, everyone. It's great to be here today. And I'm Karthik, and been at Microsoft now for 23 years. The last 10 years have all been in the field of data, like leading our own internal data transformation, and I've done that in product teams like Microsoft Office 365 and MSN and Bing, and most recently, the last 4 years have been within Microsoft's IT organization, like changing our internal data estate and evolving it forward. So very much a practitioner like all of you. I'm not from one of the Microsoft product teams, so you're going to hear more sort of applied practice and learnings from the ground. And as you all well know, data transformation is a constant journey of learning. It never ends. And if there's one key takeaway, it's that a lot of people embark on the journey thinking it's a technology sort of undertaking. And we did the same thing 4 years ago. And very quickly, we learned that technology is just one component of it. It's very much a process, culture, sort of like people, and sort of a technology dimension. Technology is the enabler. It's not the solution. And bringing all of these dimensions together is super critical. So it's been a fun ride, like 4 years in right now, and still ongoing. And really excited to be here today to talk about like our journey and share some great learnings. So if you asked a great question, it's like, hey, it's like what, like if I had to summarize, what were the key themes of our learnings, right? I think first and foremost, I would say there's got to be a purpose to want to invest in a data transformation journey. You don't just wake up one fine morning and say like, great, I'm going to go modernize my data estate. It's like there's got to be a driver for it. And for us, the driver was actually a bigger initiative around what we called our initial digital transformation. So we were really sort of looking to focus on how do we truly create better customer experiences, better employee experiences, optimize our internal business operations. And that kind of led to the evolution of what used to be Microsoft IT to becoming more of a digital transformation organization. We fundamentally rebranded IT to be named as Microsoft Digital. We brought in a digital officer from the industry. And that digital officer built out his organization based on these 3 pillars: customer experiences, employee experiences, business operations, transformation. And as a part of that, we also identified what are the horizontals that we have to put in place to really enable all of this goodness. And one of those horizontals was the data office. And I had the good fortune of sort of like coming aboard and helping build that team and actually sort of like evolve the data office within Microsoft. And it was amazing because it's the very first time the data actually got elevated from deep down in the trenches, being nested into like whatever function in the organization, like engineering and program management and operations, to actually being a top-line function of the digital office. And it was done with a lot of intent, because at the end of the day, any digital transformation investment, whichever way you look at it, the underlying fuel for it, the oxygen for it, is going to be your data and your insights and intelligence that you can generate from your data. So really recognizing the importance of needing to elevate data to a true horizontal discipline, and then and applying it as a force that can power all of the verticals, was a key reason for the move that we made. And as I said, our journey has been one of learning and discovery. We started out thinking like, hey, it's like, how do we take all this legacy infrastructure and modernize it and build the next modern, cool cloud data estate? And then we quickly learned that that journey is not going to be too successful if you try going down that road, because you're going to end up building a whole bunch of tech without really knowing what you're building it for. And instead, you really got to anchor and think about what's the true transformation that you're trying to drive. So if I had to kind of summarize the approach that we took, it was really about, very simply put, enabling responsible democratization of innovation. That was a theme that we sort of like laid out right at the outset. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing digital transformation? Why are we doing data transformation? And how do we want to go about it? Simply put, the reason we have to democratize is because the IP, the intelligence, the thought leadership around how you can actually go about transforming your current state all exists in the minds and hearts of your people. If you can get your people to actually sort of like lead the transformation for you, it's like you're probably going to soon learn that that's the right thing to do, and you'll come back to it. So right at the outset, and this was a very fundamental shift for us, because Microsoft, like most of the large enterprises, very highly centralized IT, centralized operations. And at the end of the day, a central IT team can by no means have all of the domain expertise and all of the knowledge of all of the different sort of parts of functions of Microsoft to truly transform it. So it became very obvious to us early on, to recognize that if you don't put the power in the hands of our people and help them enable us to transform, it's like we're not going to be successful in the outcomes that we want to drive. We could come up with the coolest infrastructure as engineers and technologists, but it's not truly going to deliver the outcomes and the value that you want it to deliver. So core theme for us was enabling responsible democratization. And as a part of that, enabling responsible data democratization. And my role as the data officer, as the data lead for Microsoft, was very simply put to be the core for enabling that democratization. And core itself is an acronym. It's the center of responsible enablement, right? So think of yourself as being a truly responsible enabler of your enterprise and the organization, right? And then along the way, we had lots of great learnings in terms of putting people first, in terms of being outcomes driven, shifting to an OKRs culture and objectives and key results culture to truly sort of measure and track our progress, as well as modernizing our technology to accomplish our outcomes. All of which I'll unpack as we go deeper into the session as well, but just wanted to give you a broad overview of kind of like how we approached it and the overview of our journey.
Thanks, Karthik, for sharing the internal learnings that we've had at Microsoft. I want to ask a similar question to you, Marco, from your experience working with large technology companies, media companies, and startups. Could you share a similar example of how a customer you've worked with in the past have gone on their own digital transformation journey, and what have been the learnings that you could share?
Yeah, obviously I would not make reference to one specific name, okay, but what I think, and I'm like to link to what Karthik just said, it's very important, the concept of the purpose, right? To give you an example, then I'll go to some external examples, but I'll probably a personal anecdote may be of interest here for the audience, also given what has been discussed yesterday and early this morning. When I spent 28 years with Accenture, and three years ago I decided to join EY. And I've been interviewed by all of the C-level of EY, including the chief executive. And one of the reasons why I accepted the job was because they were not asking me to play a role, to fill a role. They were asking me what would be my approach to play the role. So somehow they were asking me what is going to be the data strategy for EY according to my own, let's say, perception and intention. And I presented my opinion, and actually if I'm here, they like that, and I like the approach. And so this is telling you a lot about how undetermined is the journey of a data-driven transformation, if you like. But that means that you need to have a purpose, because in this level of underdetermination, something that I'm discussing with all of the clients is also you need to fix clearly what is your purpose, your mission, what is a set of achievements or expectations that are feasible, that you can target, right? And then you can pick up the ones you like. In my case, I like the concept of value first. Sometimes I go in meetings and I say I'm a data officer, and it's not data first, right? It's value first. That is a very important, in my own opinion, principle on framing the discussion. Is data is a mean for something more. Data is not the goal in itself. Now, going to clients, I was in a conversation recently with one of the largest semiconductor players in the world. There are not too many, so you can make some guess. And I was surprised by how advanced they were in the intention of using data, not only for them, the key message is, but across the value chain. So in the ecosystem they are playing in. And obviously a semiconductor player usually is the giant in their own supply chain, but they fully recognize the fact that just by themselves, that was not enough. For those of you that were in the plenary, the concept of data sharing, the concept of partnership around data and the value that you create through data, the standardization is something that goes beyond the internal data standards, right? You need to make sure that you speak the language of your partners in the value chain. So this is a second important point, because the concept of being part of the ecosystem gives a sense of what is your data-driven value creation. And the other point about that is a concept that I'm always discussing with clients is that the need for the data officer to be a change agent. Because all of these concepts, the data democratization, data is the new currency, data is the new oil, and you can pick up all of the slogans that we use daily, they need to become part of a practical journey. They need to be part of something that is engaging with all of the stakeholders. And once you get to the level, and I'm sure you are experiencing that on your daily lives, you need to be very practical. The slogans you can leave them out of the room. You need a narrative to inspire. You need a narrative to create focus and attention. But then you need to come very immediately, very quickly through facts that are consumable, results that are achievable shortly.
And I would just build on one of the great things that Marco said, right, which is the change agent sort of like topic. It's super critical. And I'll use another analogy, an American sports analogy, probably a global sports analogy, right, which is like American football and boxing, right? The role of a CDO in many ways is to kind of be that unicorn coach who can take a set of boxers who are as professionally trained athletes as football players, but get them to play the team sport of data, right? You try to bring like a set of boxers or individual champs and put them on a football field and ask them to play a football game together and actually partner with each other. It's a whole different ball game. Guess what? Your role as a CDO is to be the coach of getting those boxers to be an outstanding football team and actually play a game, where the game is the sport of data. That's kind of been my journey within Microsoft as well, where you've got so many different perspectives. And the one thing that everybody likes to do is build technology, trying to bring all of those amazingly brilliant minds together around a common purpose, and learning how to complement each other's strengths versus just brute forcing their own strengths is, I think, one of the a very, very critical component of this, right? And change management is essential to navigate that. So I just wanted to share that analogy because it just came to mind.
That is, if I may, that is, Karthik and I, we know since a while, and we like both. We realize that we both are using the concept of data as a team sport. Huh? We were presenting to each other, and I said, can I use your slide? They're saying the same message I like to share.
Vice versa.
But the concept of team sport is also bringing something that I think is very important in what I said, the value first, so the proximity to the business priorities, and the need to create the enablers. And they follow different lifetimes, right? The different life cycles, because the proximity to the business, you need to go close to what the requirement is today. The business wants a solution. They want the data for that specific application, for that specific business problem, for that specific service today. And they want to consume it as is, and they don't care about the scalability and so on, especially for a company like EY, that, just to put in perspective, is over 350,000 professionals in more than 120 countries in the world, with multiple businesses, some very unstructured, like the consulting business, others highly regulated, like audit or tax. So the variety of what we need to deal with is very large. And so staying close to the business means a lot of niche activities. At the same time, you need to build something that is scalable, industrial. Otherwise, you cannot sustain the volume and the innovation, because otherwise every time is reinventing the wheel at each point of consumption, right? And so how you balance, in the team sport, right, the difference is that not all of the team players have the same goals. So back to the concept of the agent, you need to find, whether it's easy or difficult, then it depends, but you need to find a good value proposition for each one of the members of the team. You need to explain why building both parties, the consumption side and the production side, they are both important, and trying to find value for both parties. Because otherwise, you are either polarized on just a non-scalable, non-repeatable model, or too much on the back end, and so people say, where is the value? So they say, oh, who cares? You should build a platform, right? If I don't see the data on my desktop. So and then you have the legal guys, the trust team, which is say, okay, well, hold on, this is something you cannot do it, or you need to do it, be careful, and so on. And you can add. So the team sport is a very interesting concept that I'm using often, but differently from a sport. In this case, the team members not necessarily play with the same priority. And that is a big challenge of the data officer's role. I presume you feel the same in your own daily lives.
And just to add to the team sport aspect, much of the team sport is important, but also when you look at many organizations who are just starting their journey, it's about how do you get business buy-in. And so I think it'd be helpful, and from my experience, we see chief data officers have a tenure of a year and a half. And a lot of the reasons we see this is because unrealistic expectations, the job description hasn't been fleshed out properly. So curious to get your thoughts, Karthik and Marco. How do you get started? How do you get business buy-in to start your program?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. I need to stand up for this one. This one is like... Yeah, and even within Microsoft, we actually went through that challenge, right? Because it was trying to figure out, so to give you some history on where we were at with data. We traversed a period about 10 years ago where we were hyper-centralized, okay? So there used to be a central team that had the keys to all the locks of data, and any and every request had to go through the central team, and guess what? Business agility pretty much took a tank for that, right? From there, we went to a state which became hyper-distributed, which is like every team creating their own data infrastructures, creating their own data systems, and running amok, no consistent ways to manage data, to govern data. You'd have paper standards, but every team would do their own thing. And at the end of the day, there was just this huge passion, as I said earlier, to just build tech, build infrastructure without really thinking about what Marco just said, which is the value outcomes. And we knew that neither approach is going to scale. You can't be hyper-centralized because you got to democratize innovation. You also can't be chaotic because then you're going to run into a whole bunch of other challenges, especially in this day and age of regulatory compliance and everything else that you got to tick off. So you got to strike a happy medium there, right? And this is where I think the approach that we are on right now is more of what I would call a responsible at the core, but federated agility at the edge approach, right? Where the responsible at the core is about how do we put in place the foundations which can and should be shared and common across sort of like all teams, while also ensuring that the foundations do not hinder or block any team in the enterprise to onboard onto those foundations and own their own data estates and own their own data value creation. Right? And how do you take concepts like data governance, which is super critical, and actually give it the modern spin, where you still hold the data owners accountable for their governance, but then you enable them with greater velocity and acceleration through automation and systems that can help them do it in a consistent way, while owning the policies, right? So for us, the starting point was really about this fundamental shift in mindset, where we had to get the leadership team to buy in and say that, look, it's like, yes, we've got great engineers. Everyone can build great infrastructure, but that's not the unique value differentiation of each of our teams. Each team has a unique value prop that they have to bring to the table, and then you got to complement that value prop to add the whole. Only then do you get to a state where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? And really needing to have a sit down at a senior leadership team level and having an alignment in terms of which teams are going to focus on value creation and which teams are going to focus on sort of like building the core foundations that are needed to enable that value creation, right? And then recognizing that trying to go from the state that we were transitioning out of was phase 2, and phase 2 was the hyper-distributed state. So from there, we had to shift gears into this new model, where we actually start bringing common foundations, but also light up value creation on those common foundations. Obviously, we can't sort of like do a lift and shift of everything on the left to the right. In fact, one of the core principles we agreed on is that a migration is not equal to a modernization, or vice versa. Like, do not treat modernization as a migration. If all you did is take, for instance, your on-premise data warehouse and put it into a cloud data warehouse, you're not going to solve anything. You'd probably get some operations efficiencies, but your value outcomes are still going to be the same, right? So the approach that we took to shift into this new world is to say, let's pick a domain. Let's pick a domain where we've got huge opportunity to go and create innovative experiences. Let's pick a few scenarios within the domain that we're going to go and light up. Let's understand the data estate that is needed to light up those domains. Let's understand what kind of skills are needed in the core team versus the edge team to create this value chain of scenarios. Now let's go iterate. Let's go iterate, take the data estate associated with that domain, modernize it in the new foundations, empower the edge team to build their data solutions and applications on that foundation, and then learn from the process and iterate. And pick a domain which actually needs you to connect data from across the company. That was key. Because in the state that we were starting from, the reason we had all those data silos is because every team was very comfortable operating their own data estates and applying their own data estates. The concept of connected data was fairly foreign to most teams, except for the teams who truly needed the connected data. So one of the teams that really needed the connected data in our world was the marketing team, interestingly, because they were truly trying to evolve their marketing practices to go from one-size-fits-all campaigns and sort of like highly segmented campaigns to truly personalized omni-channel communications. And this means that you can't just run those campaigns or programs just using campaign data. You need product consumption data. You need sales data. You need financial data. You need marketing campaigns data. You also need customer support and service data, partner data. You got to bring all of these enterprise data estates together and connect them in a way that can create this 360 view of your customer, which you can then use for hyper-personalized segmentation, targeting, and communications. That data estate never existed because each of those domains I just mentioned were owned by a separate team. Each of them had their own data estates, right? There was no consistency, there was no sort of like commonality, and everyone locked in their data estates with their keys. So pick in marketing as a domain, identifying a couple of great scenarios in marketing to truly shift towards personalized sort of like customer communications, identifying the data estate for that scenario, bringing it into this modern architecture, right from the get-go, practicing the practice of democratizing the data. In other words, putting it in the hands of the marketing functions so that they could actually pick up the data, apply it, use it, and modernize their operations. And then iterating from there, getting the learnings of doing it, and then building out the data estate and expanding out into broader functions and domains is the approach that we ended up taking. So business sponsorship is super critical. Sorry.
Can we ask a question to over the whole?
Please, go ahead.
Please do, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you, and it's very helpful to hear about the data domains and the estates and how you've democratized. As you described the last example, you now have a data domain that has multiple beneficiaries of the investments that go into that area. Mm-hmm. While you're on this thread, when you have a domain with multiple potential beneficiaries, how does that get funded within Microsoft? How are those discussions made? Because silos are clean, yet ineffective, but when you start to go to multiple beneficiaries, it creates a new funding model. How are you all managing that?
Fantastic. So let me address that with a real example. Because there are certain domains like, say, finance or HR, which, to your point, are fairly well situated in terms of an office within the organization that manages it. But the domain that we were really interested in when we started this journey was the customer domain, right? Because the heart of digital transformation is about your customer. And customer data is spread across all of these other domains that I mentioned earlier. And there really wasn't a true sort of like customer domain owner in the company. Like everybody had a role to play in managing customer data and sort of like interacting with customers. So the first aha moment for us was that we need to get a 360 view of the customer, but we don't have any single function in the organization who's accountable for governing that 360 data estate, for managing the policies around it, for creating that connected view, and then governing the applications of that connected view, right? So step one for us was to just get to that aha moment, which took us a while, because the initial projects that we ran that needed that kind of connected customer data were projects where we went after every individual team, figured out some sort of crazy way to cobble the data together, create like point assets for a particular application, and then ended up discovering that the same assets were being duplicated 10 times over for 10 different applications, and wasn't a great place to be in, right? So the approach we took then was, coming to the aha moment of realizing that we actually need a customer experience function or team that's going to take accountability for the customer data domain, right? For the connected customer data estate. It's a function that we do not have, right? And then we had the interesting question. Should this sit in IT? Should this sit in engineering? Should this sit in the business? Should it sit in marketing? Like, where should it sit, right? And then eventually what we ended up landing on is to recognize that it actually needs to sit in the business. It actually needs to sit in a business who actually is going to be accountable for governing, owning the customer data estate and operating that customer data estate. So we actually started out by picking the marketing team that I spoke to you about as the owners of that connected data estate. And then we evolved it to actually a broader V team, which included the marketing plus the sales function plus the finance function of the representatives, but led by a single leader who's point accountable for what we call our CX or our customer experience data estate. And that person then became the sponsor for that data estate, ensuring that the common policies, the governance, the applications, the practices around that data were all sort of standardized, while still empowering and enabling the different units to be able to consume and apply the data assets managed by that group.
And for the joint investments, did that body make decisions around how to allocate it out of their individual budgets, or was customer experience given a budget?
It's a little bit of both. So the way to think about it is some of the investments were truly connected as in like cross-domain across the enterprise. And these would entail that body of people, the CX team or the CX leader, helping govern and make those decisions. At the same time, to the earlier point about democratizing data to the edges, we also did not want to lock out the applicability of the data in very specific domains. Like for instance, we have customer support as a function, right? And they want to be able to build innovative customer support experiences. If they wanted to go do that, they could leverage the same the foundational data assets, which gives them the 360 view of the customer. But they could prioritize that investments to go apply it for the support universe. Versus if you take something like omni-channel customer communications, that's a lot more complex. Because now you're talking about not just marketing channels, you're talking about in-product canvases, you're talking about online websites. Now you have to bring together a set of leaders who have to orchestrate that customer journey so that we use data in a responsible way and in a meaningful way. If not, you can end up in pretty not great situations where the customer gets spoken to by different players across the company in different ways, which is not great, right? So it depends on the scenario. The long story short, the scenario determines like who gets to make the calls.
Well, and that's kind of where my question is, which one is driving which? Is the cart driving the horse or is the horse driving the cart? In, most organizations, they are standing up, enterprises are standing up complete organizations for digital in its own silo, right? In its own organization, division, and a whole division just for chief data office, right? And they have each have their own set of priorities. So where's the crossover between those and who drives which? It sounds like in the case that you just described, almost data was driving the priorities of the digital silo in your, customer experience function. But does it go in the other direction? How do these two flow back and forth?
Great question. So I would say the data foundations are led and driven by the data office, right? So the things that need to be common, like a common governance foundation, a common set of connected data assets where you want to have a single version of the truth for core constructs like customer, employee, and whatnot, right? So the core foundations are led, driven by the data team, by the data office. The applications are more federated, right? Where you've got some domains that are connected domains, like the customer experience team, and then you've got some domains that are very specific, like customer support, like finance, sales, and whatnot, right? So the federation of the data solutions and the data products to the different domain teams is built on that common foundation. So the answer to the question is it depends on the investment, and it's an ecosystem where both teams, the core team and the edge teams, will lead investments based on the nature of the investment. If it's a foundational investment, it's the data office. If it's an applied investment, it's the right domain team for the applied investment.
If I can add just one little comment to the previous question about who's paying for the same data. I think that is, in a sense, is a nice problem to have because you are already over the previous problem, which is making data visible to multiple people. So that was another type of problem we had at EY, because we were buying or licensing data on multiple places, and those data were used only once or only for that specific part of the organization. So making the data available and visible to a larger audience and therefore saving money for the purchase, but also creating better reusability, terms and conditions and so on, is the first step. Then you discuss, okay, who is going to pay for that, right? And the interesting point, maybe adding to what Karthik said, is in our case, we have, depending on the data domain, we agreed that some data domains, and a simple one is news or company financial data, they are, let's say, purchased centrally on behalf of all the entire organization. Obviously, because that is the nature of our business and also the type of data providers we're dealing with, is giving us the ability to centralize that approach. And then you can go to the other extreme, and of course there are multiple intermediate steps in which some data domains are specific to a specific part of the organization, so you then delegate entirely that. Up to the point that you don't even see those data if they are too narrow in their, let's say, utilization.
Yeah. The economics is an interesting point that he brought up, and plus one to everything he said, which is trying to figure out who pays for what at the outset can lead to, at times, making decisions that are not optimal or great. So one of the things that we agreed to at the outset is like, we'll figure that out as step 2. Let's first figure out what we need to do to connect and bring the data together. And then as we went about that, it was a pretty easy decision, actually, to recognize that anything that's a connected data asset, whether it's a data domain or whether it's a data product that's connected data, let's make it simple for the rest of the organization. Fund it centrally in the data office, right? And at the end of the day, it's about left pocket to right pocket funds movement from a company perspective, and we shouldn't be sitting and like haggling over this and making that the reason why teams go duplicate investments. And that actually ended up working out great, because a lot of teams who did not have the budget to actually fund those kinds of like connected sort of like data investments, for them it was great news, because they could literally come and partake in the ecosystem, consume those shared assets, but then apply it to their contextual domains and innovate using those assets. So this was a big shift from the previous model, which was like cross-charging and everything else. And once you start getting into cross-charge type models, it becomes a discussion of like, oh, why can't I just build this myself? I can do it better than you. And you get into all of those mechanics. So we just simplified that and said, you know what? Anything that's a shared asset, the data office funds it. And then anything that's an applied domain asset, the domain team sort of like funds it and operates it, right? So this way you get to the happy medium, and then you get the best of both worlds.
So the way you describe it, it looks like data products, right? Internal data products. But I understand that for some of these products, they must have other participants like developers and product owners and whatever, right? So outside data. So how do you guys organize yourselves in order to have these jointed efforts other than data?
Fantastic, great question. So at a macro level, the way we're organized is we have what's called a common foundations team. And then we've got the domain teams, right? The foundations team comprises of engineers, data scientists, data analysts, architects, all of whom are focused on building the common data foundations. And what I mean by the common data foundations is our enterprise data governance foundation. It includes our connected system of intelligence, which physically is like a data lakehouse, right? And then it includes our common OKRs and measurement systems. So all the things that we want everyone to sort of like reuse and repurpose as opposed to inventing their own, right? Then you've got kind of what we call the horizontal domain teams, because even the domain teams are split into 2 categories. There's horizontal and there's vertical. The customer experience team I spoke to you about, that's a horizontal domain, because they're accountable for a customer data estate, which is going to be shared by almost every function across the company. But it is still not infrastructure. It's a data domain that needs to be owned by someone, which is truly connected. The employee data estate is another example of such, right? And then you've got the actual vertical domains. The vertical domains are teams like HR, like marketing, like sales, and whatnot, right? And one of our evolution has been recognizing that the technology functions, whether engineers or data scientists or data analysts, are not just confined to that underlying team, the infrastructure team. You also need to start investing in building technology muscle, whether it is citizen technologists or whether it's professional technologists, depending on the breadth and range of your investments. You also got to build that muscle in the edge teams to truly democratize innovation. So today we're in a state where our marketing function, our sales function, our HR function has like data scientists and data analysts as a part of that team, who are very focused on building the data products that are specific to their domains by leveraging the foundations that are provided by the bottom 2 teams, right? And this has been a huge evolution for us from the past, where in the past, if any business team came and said, I want to invest in engineers, or I want to invest in data scientists or analysts, the label shadow IT will be plastered on them, right? And it's like, oh, you're a shadow IT team. We got to figure out how do we fold you into central IT. Versus now it's flipped on its head, where it's like, please invest in the functions that you need to build your data products, but just do it on the common foundation and don't go build your own foundations, right? So it's kind of fascinating for us to see our own evolution, where today our business teams have software engineers, have like data scientists, have like data engineers, analysts. And to answer your question, the way they interplay is like the data products are usually owned by the data folks. And then the software folks, the folks who build the edge-facing experiences, sort of like take dependencies and consume those artifacts and integrate them into their apps that they build, right? But that's been one of the aha moments for us, where we no longer talk about shadow IT and shadow data. We talk about just responsible democratization as being a core enabler of innovation.
So it's fair to say that the infrastructure is centralized, but the use cases are decentralized, right? So as a model.
And that's what I meant by responsible core, federated agility at the edge. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
So I just wanted to shift gears. I know this is a great discussion, but I just want to shift gears a bit here. We've talked a lot about how do you operationalize data governance inside your organization. But really the core of things, the question is, why do we spend so much time cleansing the data, profiling the data? It really comes down to making the data useful. But it doesn't just stop there. It really stops at making data trustworthy across your organization. So Marco, I'm really curious to get your thoughts on how do you have trusted data? How does EY approach really responsible data and the increased pace and innovation in data?
Certainly, the concept of trust that has been discussed also earlier on in the panel, in the plenary, is at the core, right? You can only use data if they are trusted data. So we did a number of things. One is we engaged extensively all of our data policies team, from legal to quality to risk management and so on, to review the way we were managing the data associated risks. And looking at the variety of policies that we had, as I said, EY is a large organization, and so we made an assessment, an inventory of the way we were managing data policies, and that gave us, first of all, a further element of rationalization, simplification. So we moved from hundreds of policies to a much smaller number of that. The second point, and why that was important, because we transferred the policies in what we call the data rules. And the difference between a policy, which is a piece of paper, which is telling you what you can or you cannot do, into a rule, is, in our terminology, is that you can translate the rule into a system. So the rule can be codified. Because the logic and one of the principles of our own strategy was to create a industrialization, let's say, effect. So something that can be scalable and reusable across thousands of initiatives. So transferring the rules, so defining the rules from the policies and transferring the rules into the system was the next step, which is what we did. We developed, and Microsoft is a partner of ours in this initiative, the so-called Trusted Data Fabric. The EY Trusted Data Fabric is probably one of the largest data fabric implementation on the world. And one of the key components of that is what we call the trust component. In essence, and bringing it to the simplicity, it fundamentally takes the rules that I said that require standardization. We have a portfolio of rules with variances depending on the country, depending on the business, but that now has been codified. It's a table with all of the rules. The rules have been implemented into the system. The second important point is that we went through a full review of all of the attributes that were associated to the data set at ingestion. All of these attributes have been classified. We now have something like 150 attributes that we're using, and again, down from more than 800 attributes at the beginning of the journey. And those attributes are used as a way to label the data sets at ingestion. At that point in time, those attributes are following through the lineage, through the life cycle, the entire movement of data across the entire fabric. This is very interesting and very complex because, keep in mind, we're using data across multiple multinational engagements at the same time. So red box countries, data sovereignty, and you can imagine all of the data retention policies, data obfuscation. You can name the techniques that you so having that classification with only 150 attributes. An attribute could be a country, just to make it practical. Another attribute for us is whether a client is an audit client or non-audit client, which has very different types of restrictions. And you can go on with that. But on a global basis, only 150 attributes is a small number that you can manage into a system. But why this is also interesting, because one of the part that is more advanced in our model at the moment is this concept of ABAC versus RBAC. For those of you that are not familiar, let me just give you a translation of the acronym, because a traditional system, you can pick up an ERP, is using the RBAC, role-based access controls. Depending on the user profile, the user can do or cannot do certain things. The ABAC is the attribute-based access controls, which means that by selecting and combining the attributes which are ingested at the beginning and setting them in the context of what the usage is at that point in time, so depending on who is the user, what is the purpose of using the data, in which country, in which moment, and so on, so you can have a much more accurate, let's say, technical control of the access and therefore of the usage, which brings the data, the trust level up from just trusted data to trusted access and trusted usage. So when you look at this journey that of course required a lot of discipline, a lot of, let's say, micromanagement on the low end, because you can imagine dealing with legal to say, well, your policy in Italy, is that where I am based, is the same than the one in Germany and the one in Japan, is not an easy exercise. But at the end of the day, I think we have a level of trust that is now very accurate because synchronized the policymakers, including the regulatory requirements and legal requirements, with the technology, which is now embedding into the technology the rules. So every time there's a change, we can propagate instantaneously the adjustments with the usage. That is giving a sense also of flexibility, a sense of speed, because a lot of the procedures that normally a client team or let's say a business team was required to do in terms of compliance, verification of all of the policies and so on, is self-satisfied by the platform. And so the Trusted Data Fabric is something that the EY Trusted Data Fabric is in itself a very interesting, let's say, example of how we can take data and the data technologies one level further into the logic of advanced data usage, because we are combining a traditional highly engineered data pipeline from ingestion to storage and consumption with what we call the global semantic layer, so data interoperability, okay, by reusing data sharing and so on, with the data governance. So by bringing all of those elements together, I think we've been able to create a level of a concept of trust that didn't exist before, and it forced the organization to standardize around the essence and limit the exceptions to the real ones. So this is, I think, a way to look at the concept of trusted data differently from just the quality of the data, which is very important, of course. But I think we extended the concept and the logic to an end-to-end approach to trust.
And so, Karthik, I'm sure we have a similar model inside of Microsoft of how we support trusted data and responsible AI. Could you share some thoughts on how we do it internally?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a tee-up to that, I think also building off of Marco's point, because what he's talking about is a very important concept that's starting to take shape in the industry today. Those of you who have been following like Zhamak Dehghani's sort of data mesh architecture, you know that she talks about this concept called the federated computational governance, right? So try to map that to everything that Marco just said, right? Where the federated part is the policy and the accountability for the policy configurations being with the federated domain teams. But the computational governance part is the automation of those policies at scale in a way that human capacity cannot scale to doing without automation. And I think this is kind of a very interesting paradigm that is starting to pivot sort of the notion of governance and make it more practical, pragmatic, and real. Because in Microsoft, like before we shifted to this pattern, like we were in what he rightly described as a bunch of policies as paper standards, which were handed off to teams, and then every team goes and implements their own things and does it in 10 different ways, right? Versus we really want to get to a place where the implementation could be more standardized and automated and scaled, including for the explosion of our data estate, which continues to grow by the day. But achieving that without needing to centralize the actual ownership of the data policies and the governance of the data, which we still wanted to have with the domain teams. So in our world, we pretty much practice that concept of federated computational governance, where we have a governance system which is democratized to all the data stewards and data owners across the company. and they are responsible for managing their data estates on that governance foundation. Obviously, there are some enterprise-wide policies that they don't get to sort of get a pass on, things like GDPR, SOX compliance. It's fairly horizontal, standardized across based on the domain. But there are also domain-specific policies, which they have the flexibility to configure and set up. And then underneath that system is the foundation, the computational foundation, which automates those policies and makes it possible to apply those policies across a spectrum of data estates and physical systems, so that every team doesn't have to go figure out how to go build that automation and the reporting and everything around it. So whether it's metadata management, whether it's data quality management, whether it's data lifecycle management, whether it is security and access management, all of those are the governance domains for which the policies are managed in this common platform or infrastructure, still owned by the domain owners, but automated in a consistent manner through the layer beneath, which they don't have to duplicate and replicate investments for, right? So that in a nutshell is kind of how we make it real, right?
Yeah. And I want to jump in there and say, throughout these conferences in the past year or two, we hear all these buzzwords coming out. Data fabric, you mentioned data mesh. It'd be helpful just for us to understand, how do you define data mesh versus data fabric? And then Marco, I'd love for you to go after too.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 3 hot buzzwords, which I'm pretty sure all of you have heard. Data mesh, data fabric, data hub, right? And all of these 3 patterns get spoken about in different contexts. Depending on whom you talk to, you'll probably get very different answers. And so the analogy I like to draw is my first 10 years at Microsoft, where I was more heavily in software engineering, where we had a similar sort of challenge of Lean, Kanban, Scrum. Which one do you pick? How do you get more agile? And then you realize that all of these are great practices. They all have goodness in them. But then at the end of the day, don't try to follow the practice to the T without making the needed cultural transformation and then expect magic to happen. It won't. Within Microsoft, we have so many teams who in the past have come and told us, oh, we tried the Scrum thing, it doesn't work. Lean doesn't work. We need to go back to waterfall. It's like, what did you exactly do, right? I followed the textbook, it doesn't work. No, did you culturally transform your mindset and approach it with sort of like the subtle sort of the softer aspects of agile mindset? Or did you not? And then the answer, we need to go back and think about that. So we almost spent 10 years getting through that mindset and getting to a place where software development got to a good place. And now we're seeing the same thing in data, right? When we first started our journey, these are the 3 things that were thrown at us, right? Our leader was like, which architecture pattern do you want to pick? And I'm like, I don't think there's any one pattern. I think we got to understand all the patterns and pick the goodness from each of these patterns and bring it together. And that's exactly what we did. So let me unpack this for you. Data mesh is powerful. It's powerful because it talks about, at its core, the democratization of data value creation to the domain teams who need to own the data value creation, right? That's the core of the data mesh. How do you get data responsibly democratized into the hands of your domain teams so that they can own their data value creation, their data products, but do it on a common set of responsible foundations? Like the computational governance platform, like the analytical data plane that is implemented and operated in a consistent way for the organization. A lot of people mistake the data mesh as thinking that Zhamak is proposing that, hey, every team has to go build their own infrastructure. That is not what she's saying, right? And I mean, the concept is very clear about there still needing to be common foundations on top of which you federate and democratize the agility at the edge, right? And that's the core of the data mesh. But if there's one takeaway from data mesh, it was that responsible democratization takeaway. The fabric is a powerful concept because what that really talks about is a lot of people talk about data. But if you pause for a moment and think about it, there's a lot of power in metadata, the metadata surrounding the data itself, right? So Marco spoke about ABAC as an example. But in every other context and scenario, whether it's data cataloging, whether it's data lifecycle management, whether it's GDPR compliance, whether it's SOX compliance, if you can actually accurately understand the metadata surrounding your data and can apply that metadata in an intelligent way, that is the crux of automating the bulk of data management. A lot of data management can get automated at scale if you really invest in the discipline of metadata management. And the whole data fabric concept is about automating data management and data sort of governance by leveraging metadata as a core asset and figuring out how to do it really well. So there's a lot of goodness in the data fabric. The data hub is an interesting concept because that also has a lot of value, which talks about a lot of people look at the data hub and say, oh, this is all centralization. It's actually not. It's about trying to figure out what do you centralize and what do you democratize. You can't be you can't be in a setup where everything is centralized, nor can you be in a setup where everything is democratized. You got to strike that fine balance, and that's really what the hub is talking about. So what we do is we bring together all of these 3 concepts. We embrace the responsible democratization of the mesh. We combine it with the fabric principles of leveraging metadata to automate at scale data management and governance. And we also practice the hub in terms of being very specific about certain things that should be done once in one place and everyone has to replace and has to reuse, and not everyone go back and recreate the same thing over and over again. And that what you centralize is not just infrastructure. Sometimes what you need to centralize is also single sources of truth of critical business entities pertaining to your organization. Like for instance, the customer 360 sort of like data product or data set that I spoke about, that's built only by one team, the customer experience team. It's not built by every team across the company, right? Now the customer experience team is not an IT team. They're not an engineering team, right? They're more of a biz tech team, but still it's one team, right? So the hub doesn't mean that only a tech or an IT or an engineering team can be the central authority. Sometimes the central authority might also need to be a business or an operations team, right? But recognizing what you want to commonalize and what you want to democratize is super critical.
Is the hub an organization, or is it like
It's just a concept. It's just a concept which is like what should be shared and what should be federated. So whatever is shared fits into our hub architecture, and then whatever is federated fits into our mesh architecture, and then the fabric weaves both together, leveraging metadata as the glue. Right.
Yeah, just add on that. I think it's an and, right? And let me just build a bit on what Karthik just said. And I'm using the EY example. The EY Trusted Data Fabric, as I said before, is made of a few large components. One is, as I said, is the data pipeline or integration. I'm simplifying just to give, you're all experts on that. And of course, we made a lot of engineering on the pipeline, so a lot of engineering of all of the procedures so we can move at speed from the data ingestion to data storage and consumption. So there's been a lot of engineering effort in there. There is the proper concept of virtualization or distributed data processing, which most people refer to as the data fabric, right? We call it more general, the trusted data fabric, because also the governance and the hub. The hub, in our own case, imagine is one place, the single place to go for all things data and analytics, okay? And people can select whatever they want. The most complex is the concept of data mesh that, to me, is not a technology, is an organizational construct. And to be honest, is nothing different than a product portfolio management, right? So obviously it's data-driven, so we had a lot of discussions so yesterday during some of the breakouts, but the data mesh is mainly an organizational aspect that builds on top of other technologies. There's no data mesh technology per se. You may have elements. And this takes me to another part of the question, of the comments that have been made, which is the concept of domains. This is absolutely critical and very complex, right? Because you may argue that you have a domain on the data sources, or you may have a domain on the data usages, and you probably need both, because a same area, the customer management or the supply chain or finance use multiple data domains, and the same data domains is used by multiple data destinations. So how you organize the concept of a data product with the concept of domains, with the concept of data sourcing is a very articulated and sophisticated balance, and that will depend on your own specific situation. But that is the difficult part. And then the governance and responsibilities, the technical components that bring the different types of difficulties. So they're not easy, but they're more manageable. In a sense, they're more self-defined and self-contained. The organizational side could be very complex, certainly for EY, given the articulation of our businesses.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So thank you. That touches upon what I was going to ask. First, in our practice, data is very fluid. It moves between your foundation core and responsible core. And the segregation of duties is not very easy to define. In today's technology, pipelines are being created by the domain experts, and they tend to move the data. It's not necessarily an engineering function anymore. So because infrastructure is not there, microservices make it easy for people to play all types of roles that are very hard to sort of segregate between these foundations. And that's necessarily a challenge for institutions like ours, where it's healthcare, we want to protect the data, we want to govern the data. Because data in its fluidity is moving between these different layers, and there is no way, even in spite of having a core foundation and core governance, it's hard to manage and maintain because domain people want to own that data, want to create their own assets, data assets, in spite of being responsible democratization people. They play well, but they still want to own the data. So there's a very difficult challenge that the technology, the enablement is making it happen. This problem is actually being created by enablement, and we don't know how to sort of manage that. Maybe you guys can reflect on that, please.
Absolutely. So let me share how we are doing it in Microsoft. And again, this is just, it's learning for us as well, but we've gotten to a better state than the exact challenge that you described, which we were in. So while we democratize to the domain teams to be able to own their data products and value creation, we also sort of like empower them with a common platform on which they can onboard, right? So the data products that they create, the data outputs that they sort of emit, they are not randomly deployed to different infrastructures that each of them own and operate. Instead, like one of our core tenet for any foundation that we build is that it has to be multi-tenant capable. Multi-tenant capable in the sense that any team in the past that had to say, for instance, stand up a data lake as an example or a data warehouse as an example, does not have to do that anymore, can onboard onto this foundation, but can still have all the keys and control over the creation of the data products, right? And then that's been a paradigm shift that we've been working through with our business teams, our operations teams, and getting them to that state. The other critical hook is the governance foundation, the computational governance foundation. So by virtue of standardizing the tool sets or the platforms that teams onboard to and create the data products, that platform in turn is also wired into the governance foundation, which means everything like lineage tracing and metadata capture to trace the flow of data across these pipelines. Whether the pipeline is built by a data analyst in marketing or whether it's built by a data engineer in IT, the foundations are still the same. They're all multi-tenant platforms with lineage tracing end-to-end enabled by the governance platform, right? So that's the journey that we are on, right? Where we want to empower the edges, but then we want them to do it on that foundation, which is not just a database, which is not just a data lake and a data warehouse, but which is also a common data product development environment. It's a common governance foundation, where the experiences can be leveraged through whatever familiar tool they like using to build those things. So for instance, we've got data analysts who like to use Excel, sometimes Power BI and different sort of democratized tools. And then you've got engineers who like to use Spark notebooks and all sorts of complex tech. But it doesn't matter what you use. At the end of the day, it all comes down to storage, compute, and data emissions. And being able to bring all of that onto that common sort of like foundation is the approach that we've taken, right? And we haven't gotten there all the way. We still have, to your point, some edge teams that manage their own infrastructure, in which case we go hunt them down and get them to register their infrastructure into the governance sort of foundation. But I would say right now we are probably in a 70-30 split, where about 70% of the enterprise has shifted where you've got them building on the same foundation. And then the 30% who are not there yet, even though they use their own thing, we still require them to scan and register that into the common governance space so that we at least have the visibility in terms of the metadata and to the extent possible, the lineage connections, right? So it's very much work in progress.
Yeah, no, thank you. So just to follow up, we actually are a Microsoft shop. So we sort of create these resource groups and allow them to control their own research groups to have a common core platform being the subscription. But we, like I said, the challenge is I don't think we have found a solution that can sort of govern the metadata across all these resource groups without having an understanding of really what is being created in terms of value generation every day. Because these people are truly generating value. But it's just hard to get an understanding of what that value is because it's so democratized.
So maybe an element that, and we only have 1 minute. So we created within the data office the so-called data sourcing unit, whose goal is, we classify data to simplify in external data, internal data, and client data, okay, plus the master data and so on. And the data sourcing is focusing on internal and external data, and has an end-to-end visibility and accountability on all what we do with certain data sets. Of course, we're not yet at the level of the metadata automation for all of the combination of the usage, right? Because that it requires a further level of sophistication. What we are working on is, as you understood from some of the elements I mentioned about the trust components, we're tracking, because we are labeling the data at ingestion, so it's like a barcode that goes with the life of the data set. So we're able to track all of the steps to the engineered pipelines and so on. What we are working on at the moment is trying to capture not all of the possible metadata, because probably that's too much, but the ones we believe are important, usually time-stamped are the ones that we're looking at the moment, to understand the patterns of value. The data sourcing team is looking at the business side of the data usage. The TDF, the Trusted Data Fabric engineering team, is trying to provide information to that. But certainly that has then to take to the next level. So we're not yet there practically.
I got the challenge you're talking about, though. You're talking about the next level of lineage tracing, not just the infrastructure and the pipelines and the data assets. You're talking about the value outcomes and the value creation. How do you stitch the data investments to the ROI of the value outputs, and then how do you get that 360 view? So I'll talk to you more about it offline, but we basically have an investment called the Unified Measurement Framework, which is, think of it as aggregating our OKR measurement systems data, as well as our engineering systems data, our data pipelines data, and trying to draw correlations between these to draw the connection points. But the value creation sort of stitch, it's not just an infrastructure as a data infrastructure problem. There's more to solve there.
That's what I meant to say. The cloud platform does provide that, right? But the value generation sort of gets so distributed that it's hard to capture, and then you become repetitive. You become deduplicating or duplicating something.
100%. I'll talk to you more about it offline. Yeah, but
So I just want to quickly close. We are at time, and just quickly to say thank you so much for the dialogue and the questions today. And of course, thank you so much to Marco and Karthik for your insights. It's invaluable.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.